Well, welcome everyone who's turned up. It's great to see you. You're at Turtley Wild, Kids Connecting to Nature. I'm Jasmine Paget. I'm the river keeper working for Parramatta River Catchment Group, and I'm the host today. I'm just going to go through some housekeeping. If I can decide, if the computer decides to do what I want it to. So we'd like you to ask questions in the chat function. We've got two great speakers, and I will be monitoring and I will ask questions as it seems relevant. So if you could keep your microphone muted until discussion time. It is possible that we may go over time, but we're trying to keep to an hour. I'd like to give acknowledgement of country. The Parramatta River catchment group stretches from the Hills District to the mouth of the river, which is near Cockatoo Island. That encompasses the lands of 29 clans of people who are direct in Aurora. We acknowledge the roles and responsibilities of elders past and present and emerging. We are working with elders and younger Aboriginal people on a country acknowledgement project, and we hope to showcase that next year. I just wanted to say a bit about Parramatta River. It's quite long. It's got a number of creeks, and we're looking at really encouraging people to kind of take responsibility or really be interested in their local creek, particularly because of this lockdown and getting to know your local 5-kilometer radius parks. So we're interested in hearing from you if you have some information about your local creek or your local part of the river. And it's possible that there's people here from other rivers, and we're in touch with other river keepers, so we're happy to talk to you as well. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Laura Howell is the Animals Program Officer at PLC Sydney, a girls' school in Croydon. I'm really thrilled to be working with Laura during this Riverfest. We've had a lovely story time today, and I will let Laura tell you more about the details of her work. Ryan Keith is an academic working in a range of areas and has just written the most amazing paper about kids in nature and connecting to nature, and I'm really looking forward to what he has to say. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Ryan. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, thanks, Jasmine. I'll
Sharing.
just share my screen. Thank you very much. Let's see here. All right. Well, thanks, Jasmine. I'm going to talk today, to begin with, a little bit about my personal connection to nature, but it'd be remiss of me to start on that without first acknowledging the really deep and long-lasting connections and profound connections that the traditional owners of Australia have. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging and pay deep respect to them. But Totally Wild, that's the title of the talk today, and you're probably wondering why we chose that title. Well, first of all, I'm a sucker for a pun, and I hope you are too. Really wanted to make reference to this iconic piece of Australiana. If you particularly grew up in Australia in the 90s, like myself and Laura, or perhaps even later, you would certainly be familiar with Totally Wild, and almost certainly familiar with Ranger Stacey, who was the leader at the helm of Totally Wild throughout its entire run. You see her here with Agro, probably the most dangerous animal to handle. And, you know, growing up, I'd see Ranger Stacey and think that's pretty cool. And she inspired a bit of a love of Australia's unique in me, and I'm sure in Laura and others. And we basically turned out to be miniature Ranger Staceys, I guess you'd say. So that's one of the formative aspects of my connection to nature, seeing the amazing diversity of what we have on offer here in Australia. And that also led me to fall absolutely in love with Australian fauna in particular. I'm a founding member and a current committee member of the Wildlife Conservation Fund. Laura's also been with us since the very beginning. And basically, I was a little bit disappointed earlier this year to receive the news that Totally Wild has been axed. And that's after almost a 30-year run, which made me pose the question, what does this mean for the next little crop of miniature ranger stacys? And might that mean that we've got less interest in conservation as well? Now, I looked to the literature for a bit of a solution to this question, and you find this iconic paper from 2006 where you have a couple of Cornell professors who asked over 2,000 adults in the United States about, how they experience nature as children, interviewed them, compiled all those results, and they found that essentially it's not just watching TV that's going to connect you to nature. So, obviously there's more than just Totally Wild. It's about participation as well. And that can set an individual on a trajectory towards adult environmentalism. And by environmentalism, they don't mean being a card-carrying member of an organization or another. What they meant is being an environmentalist is acting in pro-environmental ways. So things you can do in your daily life to essentially be environmentally friendly, and also whether your attitudes are environmentally friendly. And it turns out that going camping, fishing, planting trees, activities like this as a child were certainly helpful in forming the environmental identities of these adults who were interviewed. So there might be hope still for the next generation. If even though Totally Wild's off our screens, there might be other ways to connect with nature. I certainly am the beneficiary of some of those activities when I was a kid. That's me in the middle, wearing white, fishing down 5 minutes from my house. And I should say, I was lucky where I grew up in Sydney. I'm on the edge of Sydney, down in the Shire. So this is the outlook from the back of my parents' house. This is where I grew up. And you can see we've got a bush outlook. And that meant that essentially we were 100 metres from the Royal National Park, which is the oldest national park, the second oldest national park in the world, to Yellowstone. It's been around since 1879. I took all of those photos of those species literally in the back or front yard of my parents' house. So I really couldn't avoid nature. But of course, other parts of Sydney, it might not necessarily be the same. Here's an example of a school that I work with out in Western Sydney, and the purple outline is their school catchment. So everyone who attends that school comes from within that catchment. This is a satellite photo from 2004, and you can see the area is fairly green. You've got a lot of open green space. You've got a smattering of trees throughout there. But if you look a little bit further down the timeline, in 2018, you've got hundreds and hundreds of homes popping up on the same site. You have a bit of a wildlife corridor, it looks like, down the middle there. But that green space has been fragmented into smaller areas. And you wonder what that might mean for people who are living in that area and how they interact with nature. But bringing it a little bit closer to home, because this is Riverfest, we'll look at an area along the Parramatta River. So this is Homebush Bay. I'm sure Jasmine would recognise it, and many others too. And back in October 2002, of course, the Olympics were over, but you still had great development in this area. So it used to be a commercial area. You can see on the left-hand side, if you look closely, the Hyundai headquarters and factory was there. But in the ensuing, decade and a half, there's been two entire suburbs pop up on this site. You've got Wentworth Point that has a population density of about 20,000 people per square kilometre, and Rhodes, which has a population density of about 13,000 people per square kilometre. You get an idea of how they're living when you can see these large shadows on the satellite image. They're coming from skyscrapers essentially, or higher buildings. And so there's high density residential living going on here. So much so that they actually also built a school here at Wentworth Point. So there's children growing up in this area, and you do see the edge of Newington Park there on the left-hand side. So there are some green spaces remaining. But in a lot of cities around the world, there are fairly pressing concerns about what high density living might mean. So we've got this rather special issue of the journal Science that was published in 2016. And the academics were making the point that if we've got increasingly dense urban areas, well, maybe that means people are going to have restricted contact with nature. And the problem there is if we accept what we experience of nature in childhood as perfectly normal and what you're experiencing is fairly limited, then perhaps you won't be interested in environmental problems, and there'll be inaction as a result. You've also got concerns like this mirrored in New South Wales education website. This School A to Z guide was put together as a guide for parents. And if we zoom in here, we see the statement that today's kids spend far less time outdoors. That's obvious. And that it's called nature deficit disorder, which was a term coined by Richard Louv. If you're unfamiliar about who Richard Louv is, it looks like this. That photo was taken when he visited the Royal Botanic Gardens in 2013, and he was interviewed by the Department of Education. Earlier, and the reason he basically was invited out here is because he wrote this best-selling book, Last Child in the Woods. Now, from his experience in Australia and from his summary of the limited research that was available at the time, in 2014, he made the comment that Australians are suffering from nature deficit disorder. So we've got the proclamation there. But what's interesting is in that exact same year, we had the editor of the Australian Journal of Environmental Education asking, where are the children and young people in this research? And it's equally applicable to that early stuff that Richard Louv was summarising, in that a lot of it was epidemiological, a lot of it was based on adults, and we really didn't know too much about what was happening with Australian children. That's where my research comes in. I set out to basically measure connection to nature across Sydney because I wanted to know, are our kids in this city experiencing a nature deficit? Which of our kids living in the city connect most strongly to nature, because we can probably learn from them, and particularly what the effects of age and gender are in that. And then once we identify these students who connect strongly to nature, we figure out, do they behave in environmental ways? Are they willing to conserve nature? And how do they connect to nature? So a lot of these questions what I'm going to be answering today throughout this talk. And a lot of it is based on this recent publication of mine that Jasmine mentioned at the beginning. It's an open access article, which means you can Google that, you can pull it up yourself and have a read if you so wish. It's not behind a paywall. So if you really want to dig into the details of what I'm talking about today, please feel free to do so. Basically what I did was engage with 16 schools across Sydney. And I do mean across. You can see they're pretty broadly spread. We've got some in the east, some in the west, some in the north, some in the south. And obviously in these different areas, we've got different densities of living, different proximity to different types of nature. For example, bushland, you've got the ocean on the other side. So tried to get sort of a representative sample. We had 8 primary schools and 8 secondary schools, 1,037 respondents, and they were aged between 8 and 14 years. So we recruited from school year 3 to school year 8. And if we look at connection to nature, we need to know how to measure it. So we specifically used this measure that was created by Judith Cheng and Martha Munro in 2012. And it's a measure of affective connection to nature. Now, that's not a typo, affective instead of effective, because what we're referring to here is affect, which is emotion. So we're looking at emotional connection to nature in these children. Basically, they respond to 16 statements, and those statements are in 4 different areas. Enjoyment of nature. So when I feel sad, I go outside and enjoy nature. Empathy for creatures. I feel sad when wild animals are hurt. Sense of oneness. Humans are part of the natural world. And sense of responsibility. My actions will make the natural world different. So each of these these statements have 5 different response categories, and you give each of those response categories a score, sum up that score, then take an average to get an overall connection to nature index score, CNI score. And it turns out that you can then use that to categorize the participants. So if you've got a CNI of over 4.56, you're strongly connected. We're going to use some visual shorthand here. So we've got Lisa Simpson with a little pot plant. Then we've got moderately connected between 4.06 and 4.56. Again, another little Lisa. And then less than 4.06 is weakly connected. And those numbers are based on some research done by Jolene Hughes, Miles Richardson, and some others over in the UK, in England. So if we take the CNI scores and we look at that over the year groups that I sampled, we find that overall 3 in 10 students were strongly connected to nature. But that's an average figure. So if you actually break it down, we see that there's quite a strong division here between primary school aged children and high school aged children. And if you just look at the primary and secondary aged children separately, you find that almost half of our primary students connect strongly with nature, whereas only 1 in 5 of the high school students do. And so we refer to this as the adolescent dip. And by we, again, I'm referring to Jolene Hughes and Miles Richardson and some other researchers in the UK who are at the moment basically the only other people to have found this. And we found it at roughly the same time. So we actually got together at a conference and had a brief chat about it. And we're wondering, is this found everywhere in the world? Is it a normal thing that happens and then you'll get a rebound into adulthood, as you see up the top here from Miles Richardson's work? But again, these are cross-sectional studies. These are not longitudinal. So we're not following children over a life course and sampling their nature connection as we go. We do think that there are some possible causes for this dip, and these need a lot of research. So it's quite speculative at the moment, but they're based on previous research. So first of all, you've got this change in curricula as you're going from primary to high school. And so basically the way that nature is presented in the curriculum may change. It may become, for example, more scientific. You might only or primarily be discussing nature in science lessons. You've also got a change in friendship groups when children transition between schools. They've basically got to reform their identity with their peers, particularly if they don't have any friends who have come to the high school with them. And that also potentially affects connection to nature, because connection to nature is a part of what we call environmental self-identity. So if identity is changing, environmental self-identity is likely to change. Then we've got this increase in autonomy. And by that I mean there are some certain freedoms that you get when you're growing up into high school. For example, some children are allowed to walk to school once they get to high school. They're seen as growing up. And with that sense of autonomy can sometimes be a little bit of detachment from parents, for example, which means you might be taking fewer cues from your strongly environmental parents and making up your own mind as to how you might feel about nature. So that could also cause a difference. Then we've got priority changes. And when you're in primary school, it's a great time to be alive, no doubt, but you don't necessarily have a lot going on. So you can prioritize going out into nature if that's something you enjoy. But when you're in high school, there's a whole lot going on. Suddenly you've got to juggle a lot of different priorities, and you might be more interested in other things. Then, of course, there are biological changes. Some things that are almost completely unavoidable, which is when you go through puberty, you've got hormones being released that'll cause you to act differently. It changes our emotional regulation, as an example. And then we've also got a maturing brain. And I don't mean that in a perfectly general sense. There's good neuroscientific research that shows that younger people have a highly entropic brain, which means it functions in a less ordered state. And as we grow older, we have decreased entropy. And we find that people with highly entropic brains are also connected to nature. So that may also be a potential influence here. So what does this mean in terms of nature deficit? Well, overall, 2 in 5 of our students were weakly connected to nature. So I wouldn't probably go as far as Richard Louv to say that Australians are suffering from nature deficit disorder. I'd qualify that a bit by saying some, But not all, or even most, of the students that I sampled have weak connections to nature. And again, we notice that there's this critical break here between the primary school ages and the high school ages. So how do we help children maintain their connections to nature throughout adolescence? That's a key question for further research, but also for practice as well. And hopefully Laura can give us a couple of tips of what she's been doing with this age group. Now, the conversation ran with the title, 1 in 2 primary age kids have strong connections to nature, but this drops off in teenage years. Here's how to reverse the trend. That was our piece that came out recently. And I don't want to give away too many spoilers because Laura's also going to give us an idea of things to do to reverse the trend. But one suggestion based on good previous research is programs like the Urban Field Naturalist project. Now, the Urban Field Naturalist, if you haven't heard of it, is a collaboration between the natural sciences and the humanities. And that's actually quite important because we're not therefore just looking at nature through a scientific lens. It also opens up to different ways of knowing nature in non-scientific ways. So if you go to urbanfieldnaturalist.org, and I'm not really affiliated with Urban Field Naturalist apart from being a contributor. I've written 1 or 2 narratives for them, and that's precisely what they provide resources for. It's all free. It teaches you how to notice urban nature and then to maybe commit your thoughts about urban nature into some words. That can be a really good reflective task to help people consciously interact with what's around them. You might even find some surprising visitors in urban areas. So our other major finding was that girls connected more strongly to nature than boys overall. And there were 2 primary drivers of that difference. The first of those being the girls responded more positively to statements about sensory stimulation in nature. And those statements were, I like to hear different sounds, I like to see wildflowers, I like touching animals. So it's wholly consistent with previous research on adult women who also showed increased preference for sensory stimulation in nature. And that also helped explain the difference between women and men. Girls also scored higher on the empathy for creatures subscale of the connection to nature index. And that's important to keep in mind when working with girls. And luckily we have an expert on working with girls with us today. But that leads to the question, these younger girls that seem to connect strongly with nature, or, you know, these examples of students for whom that seems to be really important and really strong, what can we learn from them in terms of environmental behaviour? Are the strongly connected students more committed to pro-environmental behaviour? So here we're going to compare the pair. We've got Lisa, you know, same age, same gender, controlling for a number of factors. But what we're looking at here is if the same child is weakly connected versus strongly connected, how would that impact their behaviours? And this is based on logistic modelling that I did. And what you find is that the strongly connected individual is 4 times more likely to save water, 4 times more likely to save energy, 3 times more likely to recycle on a daily basis. They're also twice as likely to advocate for nature, so speak to friends and family about protecting nature, to volunteer for conservation, and to also donate money. And that's a willingness measure. So the $1 million question then becomes, how do weakly connected individuals transition to become strongly connected? I measured a lot of variables. So I didn't just measure connection to nature index. And I know this looks a little bit crazy, this diagram at the moment. So I'm going to simplify it for us somewhat. Basically, we've got a range of possible things that could impact connection to nature. And the red lines indicate a negative relationship between the variables, and the black lines indicate a positive relationship. And the thicker they are, the stronger the relationship. But there are only 3 that directly impact connection to nature, and that is those 3: household biodiversity, nature-based activities, and learning about nature. So this research isn't published yet. I'm giving you a bit of an exclusive here. So we'll look at these 3 and give an example of each that strongly impacts connection to nature. First of those, household biodiversity, was our measure of how much outdoor vegetation like trees do you have around the household? How many house plants, how many pets, bugs, other wild animals are around? No single one of those had a positive, strong impact on connection to nature. But if you combine them into an index and get an overall picture, perhaps something a little bit like my backyard growing up, you find that it does have a strong impact on connection to nature. So the students who had weak connections to nature, they also had a low household biodiversity. Students who had moderate connections to nature also had moderate household biodiversity, and students who were strongly connected to nature tended to have high household biodiversity. And that's something that we can change, unlike hormones and things like that. So if you're wondering how to do that, there are resources like Backyard Buddies that explain how to modify the home to increase potentially biodiversity, so to make it more nature friendly. So I recommend checking something like that out if you're interested in increasing household biodiversity. And then when we look at nature-based activities, we've got those classic ones from the Wells and Leckie study I mentioned right at the beginning, like camping and fishing. But perhaps the most impactful behaviour that we found was looking for wild animals. So if you never look for wild animals, you're likely to have a low connection to nature if you're a child. If you do it occasionally, you'll be moderately connected to nature. But if you are always on the lookout and you're doing this daily, you're likely to have a strong connection to nature. So perhaps investing in a pair of binoculars or getting involved with a project like Big City Birds might be good if you're interested in connecting via this pathway. And then learning about nature. What's interesting here is classroom learning didn't have a huge impact in our study, but I'm sure Laura's going to explain how to make our classroom learning more impactful. But we did find that reading about nature in print, of all things, was the most strongly associated behaviour with high connection to nature for those that we measured. So conversing with friends and family, learning about nature on TV or online. It was the physical media, the books, the magazines that really stood out. And so if you never read books about nature, you're likely to be weakly connected to nature. But if you read about them often or sometimes, you're likely to be moderately connected to nature. So perhaps investing in a nice nature book would be a good idea. And we've got this article also from the conversation, which is a good place to start with a list of resources. So I will hand over to Laura in just a moment. But before I do, because I mean, obviously she's going to continue right on where I left off, I would like to acknowledge the other contributors to my work. So my co-authors and supervisors, also the members of the Integrative Ecology Lab, who are generally my sounding board for a lot of my ideas, and then also the students, teachers and parents who participated in my research. And with that, I will thank you. I look forward to questions at the end, and I'll hand over to Laura.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ryan. Now, I don't have a fancy PowerPoint because a lot of my work that I do with kids, if we take photos, we can't actually share it. But if you are interested, when I start talking about the school and where I work, you can jump onto the school's website, and I believe they still have a virtual tour. So you can actually jump on and have a look at the school grounds, and it might make more sense to you if you do that afterwards. But I'd like to start by acknowledging that today I'm coming to you from Wangal land, and I'd like to acknowledge their traditional care for country, and that's what makes me really excited to be able to talk about how at the school we're utilising native Australian animals to connect with the girls here at PLC. So a little bit about the school and myself. PLC is the Presbyterian Ladies College in Croydon in Sydney. We are a girls' school from pre-K all the way to year 12. And we also have a transitions class, which is a class that helps girls with mild and moderate intellectual disabilities to integrate in both school and life after school. So it's pretty amazing to have some of the girls in that class actually work directly with us here as well. At the school, I'm pretty lucky. We have behind me, I'm actually in our turtle hatchery at the moment. I can explain a little bit more what this is for. We have a collection of live animals that includes turtles. We have the hatchery, we have a turtle pond, and we have a second turtle tank over in our pre-K to year 2 campus. So they have a turtle to hang out with whenever they feel like as well. And then we also have an invertebrate house, which is a little dome structure that our displays of invertebrates change depending on what we feel like is cool at the time, but we generally will have stick insects, praying mantis, spiders on display, and we can use that space for learning. And we can also use it, we do run lunch club as well, so girls can come in at lunchtime to help us out doing that. So a bit more about me. I have always been inspired by nature, and this goes back to what Ryan was saying as well, from childhood. In my case, my mum was never really into nature. She didn't really think that animals were cool, whatever. She was busy doing her own thing. And my grandma actually is my inspiration into nature. She's got a little house, again, near Ryan's parents' place, actually, that overlooks the national park down in the Sutherland Shire. She's got a backyard full of chickens. She's always had chickens. And has always had the native birds come down. So I think that's what was one of the inspirations for me. We'd also, when I was younger, every week go to the national park for a barbecue with her and all her German friends. So that's something that I will always remember, and I think was the kickstart for me, having that connection with nature, which I then built upon, especially when I got into high school. I really enjoyed biology and got to look after the fish tank at school, and ended up going into zookeeping, which is how I met Ryan. And now I've ended up in this very niche job here at the school. The job that I have here doesn't exist anywhere else, and we're very lucky to have the job that I do. So in saying that, I want to take parts of what Ryan has been finding in his studies and what he's presented, and sort of discuss how we've been putting learning with nature into the classrooms. And I do acknowledge that some of the facilities that we have here in PLC might not be available to the everyday teacher, but I know that teachers are really creative. I work alongside an amazing group of teachers, and we can get creative, and we can try and bring nature into different parts of the curriculum that you wouldn't expect nature to be in. And I think that's what is the cool part about my job, is figuring out how to get nature into the everyday, even when you don't think it's going to be there. So Ryan was saying that it's harder to engage, or there's that drop off with our age groups as they get older into the teenage years. And even though we do work with girls, so I have it easier, it's easier to engage the girls in nature and what I do than it is with boys, we still do find that they do have a drop off from about year 6 onwards. We won't be as interactive with the girls from that point. Sometimes it's got to do with the syllabus. Year 6 doesn't really have as much of a connection with nature. The year 3 girls have their own, so they do food production stuff, they grow their own garden. It's really fun, hands-on. Same with the younger kids from kindy, they'll do living things. So it's really easy for us to jump in with adaptations and living things and food chains and all that sort of stuff. But some of those years, they don't focus so much on that. So it's hard for us to sort of engage them. And also once they go from our junior campus off to the senior campus, we don't have many of our invertebrate displays in there. We've got a few fish tanks, so we're sort of lacking that connection. But they also move from classroom to classroom, whereas for our younger girls, they're in the one classroom, so we can actually set up a fish tank, or we can set up stick insects or whatever it is, and they can keep it for the whole year and have that constant engagement. Even if it's not them going over every single day, they still have that animal in their classroom, which we can't really do with the senior girls. So I wanted to give a few examples of how we've been able to engage some of the older girls with the curriculum where you might not expect nature to be present. So an example that I got to be a part of during our latest lockdown. Year 6 were doing a food production unit. So usually we haven't been involved with this, but our science teacher had them growing tomatoes at home. So as part of that, they actually had to write out their own diary. I have an example here. So they would write out when they planted the tomatoes, any observations that they had. And for one of their lessons, I actually got to figure out how to make a really cool video, not a video editor, but now I am. And I did that on pollination. So with their tomatoes, one they were growing in a closed system, like they might do with hydroponics, and one they were just growing open, like you might do in your backyard. And my video was about how invertebrates might interact, good or bad, with your tomatoes, and what you might need to think about if you're going to set up your different systems for growing. So basically, we're looking at pollinators and pests, and I actually took the time to walk around the playground and film the invertebrates that I could find. So we found bees, wasps, and then we found aphids as well. So the girls then had their own discussion about, if you're in a closed system, you won't have bees, so you'd have to self-pollinate. But if you're in that open system, you have the bees, but the trade-off is you might have the pests as well. So we've just got the booklets in this week, and I've had a look at a few of them, and there's in every booklet, there's a page where the girls have had that discussion on paper with the pros and cons and what they might choose to do. So that was a cool way to engage them. They usually wouldn't have that discussion for food production, and it was also a way for us to engage when they weren't at school and still have that rooted in the school playground, which I thought was really cool as well. And potentially if they do that next year and they can be at school, we can actually walk around and find those animals, invertebrates in the playground. And we have done that with year 3 on not as much of an intense level, but when they're doing their gardens, we do a lesson on pests and pollinators, and we bring around examples and let the girls look at them, tell us if they think it's a pest or a pollinator, and actually have that up close interaction with the invertebrates. Another example for year 6, who again, I thought didn't have that connection in the syllabus to nature. They do a whole topic on bridges. So pretty boring for, you'd think, a nature lover, but our science teacher actually started with a book to get the ball rolling. I've got it with me. It's called Crossroads. It's pretty amazing. It's a book purely on animal wildlife crossings around the world. So it has examples from Canada and Australia. And their task was then, instead of just building a bridge for a pedestrian to cross or for a car to cross and telling us why they use certain materials and all of that, they actually had to build a wildlife bridge. So they were in groups and they had to be able to build the bridge for a brush-tailed possum to be able to cross. And our science teacher even had the stuffed brush-tailed possum with some weights on, and she'd put it on the bridge. And some of them, depending on how the animal was meant to move over the bridge, you'd have to hope that the bridge stays up with the possum on it. So that's another example of how we can put nature into a topic that you wouldn't expect. And a lot of the times we actually start with a picture book, and it can be from K to 6. Depending on the book, you could probably even go into some of the older years as well. But I think that's interesting, especially with Ryan saying the more that you have that actual book that you're reading can help engage with your overall feeling of being part of nature. I find that the books actually just start off getting the kids in the mindset, and then we can build upon that. So we're trying to make it as immersive as possible. For example, with that one, how to make things more immersive with books. We've also used the book called Twig. I brought that with me as well. This one is Twig. It's about a stick insect. And we use this to inspire year 3 in creative writing. So again, maybe not something you'd think you'd have a lesson with stick insects for creative writing, but that's what we did. So the girls read the book Twig. And then they actually came into the invertebrate house, and we showed them different types of stick insects, different types of invertebrates, so spiders, And we actually had them describe them. So what color is it? It's a creamy yellow. Use those descriptive words, write it down, and then we created a story together using the descriptive words, giving them a problem and a solution, all in the invertebrate house. So again, when you think story writing, you're not going to think, oh, let's go have a lesson about stick insects, but we can definitely do that. Some of the other things that we've done that are a little bit outside of the box, we've done kindy and year 3 maths. So for kindy, really simple, we're just doing counting. We'd have a spider, we'd count how many legs the spider had together, up to 8, and then ask the girls, if we had 2 spiders, how many legs would there be? So continue counting. You can do the same with legs, you can do the same with eyes. It can be stick insects, it can be spiders, it can be turtles, it can be how many birds that you have in the playground. It's a really easy one that you can do simple counting, or you can make it a little bit more complicated. For year 3, we did measurement. So we weighed and measured the length of some of our biggest stick insects, and we compared how much longer is the Goliath stick insect to the spiny leaf stick insect, for example. We weighed our turtles. We weighed an adult turtle and one of the baby turtles. What is the difference in weight? So we'd have all of that information down, and the teacher would then actually give them problems using the weights and measurements that we got from that day. So that's another way to connect them and make that experience really unique to them. I'm not sure any other kid in year 3 has learned about weight and measurement using turtles and stick insects. So that in itself is a memorable event that hopefully will continue on past the adolescent dip and into adulthood. So there's backyard birds is another good one. For year 4, their syllabus last year was sort of backyard birds as one topic and then the environment as another. And this year, our science teacher, along with their teachers, decided to try and combine it, and it became shorebirds. So a bit of trial and error this year, but we made it work. And again, we started out with a picture book, The Godwits, which I think was read already this week for Riverfest. Yeah, and we started with that. And then went off and we actually did a little excursion down in Canada Bay to spot our shorebirds. And we were able to actually see human impacts on the shorebirds firsthand and have that discussion firsthand with the girls. So you don't actually need to be in school to do this. You can take your kids out after school or on the weekend. And we saw a man letting his dog walk off lead along the beach where the birds were. We saw the build-up of the urban environment along the beach. We saw the pollution, and the girls were able to easily see that for themselves, and then do a project on it, which I think was really cool. And when you're going back to looking for wild animals and how that can have a connection with nature, that's there with the shorebirds. It's also there with backyard bird count, which we did last year. Unfortunately, we can't do it this year because we don't have all the girls back at school. But last year we did that as well. For kindy, again, starting with a picture book. You can tell I'm inspired by them. Start with that book, get them excited about birds, go out and do the backyard bird count with the kids in the playground, and a lot of them would go home and do the same thing. When we got to the older girls, we actually teamed up with the tech side, and they had little counters, and one would be like, I'm going to count the magpies on our walk, the other girl would count the ibises, and then at the end we'd tally them all up. So you can make nature learning really creative, and you can make it work with the girls that you're working with, or boys, or the kids, the grandkids. It doesn't matter. I always like to start with the picture book to give you inspiration, but there's so much that we can do. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the turtles themselves, because that is probably one of the biggest programs that we have here at the school, and that's why I'm in a turtle hatchery at the moment, and what we do with the turtles. So we have used them in lessons. We've got the measurement lesson that's a bit out of the box. We use them for adaptations. We can bring out a turtle. We can bring out a turtle, like a model of a skeleton. We can talk about their adaptations. We can get the girls to touch the turtle, see the turtle. We can watch the turtle swim, so they can see all of that firsthand. Same with living things with kindy. You can compare. We've done turtles versus stick insects. What are the same things? They need food and air and all of that. What's different? We can go all the way up to year 11 when they're learning about the nitrogen cycle. I've gotten really good at water testing here. We've got a lot of tanks, so we can talk about what affects our water quality, how we manage the nitrogen cycle, what is different or the same between a big tank here or out in the river. And we've also been able to do talks with year 10 about both endangered and invasive Australian animals. So I think the turtle is a good point there, because a lot of them are endangered or should be considered endangered. And majority of the time it's either from invasive species like foxes or human development. So they're really good talking points to have with turtles. So for next year, our hope is to finally utilise the room that I'm in, which is the turtle hatchery. We had it built ready to go actually for last year's turtle breeding season, and COVID has put us on hold for 2 years now. But basically what we'll be doing is working with Ricky Spencer and the Million Turtles group to actually get wild turtle eggs collected from the wild, and they're going to be in this room to incubate safely, away from foxes, away from people, nice and safe in this room until they hatch out. They'll get to have a little bit of a holiday in the tank behind me where they can learn to swim and eat, and we can make sure that they're fine. And then they'll be re-released in the area that they were found. So that means that the girls here will be able to help us weighing the turtles. They'll be able to help us watch their activity, feed the turtles, all of that sort of stuff. We have started that just with the turtles that we have. We have one of the girls from Transitions who helps us out every week. She loves turtles. We love her. It's helping with her socialization. She also gets to help us weigh the turtles, measure the turtles. So we've been using our turtle hatchery and the turtles that we do have at the moment as a bit of like a learning curve for when we do have hopefully hundreds of turtle eggs and hundreds of girls that want to be involved. But the plan for that eventually would be able to, once it's tried and tested here, to move that out into other community spaces and have not just the school do turtle conservation, but have it across the Parramatta River community. So that's, I think, a good example of what I do. And I'm sure everyone has lots of questions, and I don't want to just talk about me all day. So let's get into some questions.
Well, that's fabulous, Laura. That's really great. One of the first questions was around insects and spiders. And does that is that kind of learning means that they are more comfortable with insects and spiders in their everyday life?
Yeah, generally we do find that. And the joy of having a K to 12 or pre-K to 12 here at the school is once they get into year 7, we have a really big influx of girls from other schools just to do their senior school here. So you can tell the difference between the girls that have been brought up from K to 6 in the playground with the turtles and with the stick insects. When they come in for their lessons, they're not as freaked out. Sometimes I think it's a bit of a show, like, oh, let's all scream at the spider because everyone else is screaming. But generally, we've had this program running in the school for 5 years now. The longer that it's running, the less freaked out the older girls are as well. And I'll even have some of the year 4, 5, 6 girls now come to me in the playground and be like, I found this cool spider. Can you tell me what it is? Whereas that's not something that we would have seen 2 or 3 years ago. So I do think that it helps with that engagement with the weird and wonderful. And also the reason why we have so many invertebrates is you don't need any licenses or anything to keep them in schools. So they're one that you can display really well and not have any hurdles to jump through like with turtles. So they're a really good one to have in classrooms. It could be as simple as a silkworm, but you can have stick insects as well without any problems.
Oh, good. Okay, so there's a question for Ryan regarding a recent research on the benefits of learning outside for school students. So I'm presuming Kate, that means that they're actually doing outdoor excursions and outside of the classroom, even if they're in the playground.
Yeah, sounds like a an exciting way of doing things. Yes, there is quite a bit of research about the benefits of outdoor learning. The one that comes to mind, and one that's also a publicly available paper, like mine is, on PLOS One, so the same journal, is from some researchers in the UK, and it was published in 2019. And the title of that one, I pulled it up on my phone so I could give you the exact title, is Curriculum-Based Outdoor Learning for Children Aged 9 to 11, a qualitative analysis of pupils' and teachers' views. So basically, that's interview-based with the participants in outdoor learning, both on the teacher side and on the student side. And there's a summary there of some of the benefits to that. I believe there's also a piece in the conversation, which I also wrote in, that is associated with that. So there'll be a summary from those authors in their own words about their research to look at for that one. In addition to that, there's a couple in the proceedings for the National Academy of Science, which I believe is a paywall journal, but there's information there about green space and cognitive development in primary school children. In fact, that's the title itself, Green Spaces and Cognitive Development in Primary Children. So that is also a good place to start. And they're both fairly recent papers. I think one from 2019 and one from 2017-ish. So hopefully that's a place to start.
So either Ryan or Laura, you might know about resources to support nature play and outdoor learning as a place to start to advocate for primary students. You know, what organizations would you suggest other than the Urban Field Naturalists?
Sure, I'll jump on that one in just a sec, but I remembered one more thing. Another really good place to look for recent research on outdoor learning is, I know Professor Tonya Gray at the University of Western Sydney does a lot of research in this area, and she's also written for places like The Conversation to summarise some of that research. So Tonya Gray, Tonia Gray, is another place for resources. But in terms of associations and groups to potentially join, I know the Australian Association of Environmental Educators, or Australian Association of Environmental Education, is a big peak group, and it has local chapters for different states and so forth. So they hold events and so forth that you might be able to get along to. I believe they have a paid membership, so that one might be a bit of a commitment. But there's also Nature Play, I think natureplay.org.au, but don't quote me on that. They have a list of resources on there about promoting nature play. But Laura, if you've got any others to add to that, I think the main two that come to my mind, front of mind.
Oh, I think the only thing that I would add is sort of where I've been involved outside of the school that you can potentially sign up for. It sometimes excursions. You can go down to Symbio and have a guided tour. You can book that through Ranger Jamie's as an example, or at Wildlife City Zoo, you can book your own zookeeper tour. Taronga has similar things as well. So if you yourself aren't particularly sure on what you're looking at and giving the information to your students, you can definitely just start with an excursion and get the professionals to give you that information as a starting point. You can book in for that. And I think that's a good thing to start with to get the ball rolling. And then you can bring it back into the classroom as well. I also found with bird counts last year, you could sign up as a teacher and they'd actually give you teaching resources on how to bring bird count into the classroom. So a lot of the times I'll read through that sort of stuff and then go to the teachers with my ideas and we'll make it work for the classroom.
So in the state school system, there's environmental centres, Kate was reminding us, and there is the Field of Mars Environmental Education Centre, which is excellent. And at Parramatta River catchment group in local governments, there's our members link in with schools sometimes through the Environmental Education Centre or sometimes through an environmental network. And councils and schools sometimes get grants together. And, you know, for example, in one of the Canada Bay schools was doing work about the Godwits, and the signage that the council put up was based on children's drawings and children's perspectives. So they could see it in hard metal, you know, signage proper. So that was a great outcome.
That's awesome. I might add one more to that list of environmental education centres, because it's not an education centre by name, but the Royal Botanic Gardens also do work with children. I've actually recently done some of my research at the Royal Botanic Gardens with looking at school groups and how they benefit from those excursions. It's not recent research because it's not published yet, but we'll have forthcoming research that I can send people to that talk about the benefits of outdoor learning in that particular scenario.
So Ryan, there is a question regarding a prospective cohort study to better assess the age-specific trends of the adolescent dip and the connectedness to nature. To your knowledge, has anything been done cross-sectionally in identifying how education can spark and increase the CNI scores before and after lessons and classes?
That's a great question. In terms of the CNI, that's one of about 20 different ways of measuring connectedness to nature. And so the thing we have with studies is there might not be many specifically using the CNI, but there are a couple looking at environmental education in general. One I'm thinking of was done in Singapore, and they looked at the impacts of environmental education there. It's actually referenced in my paper that I mentioned earlier, so it's on there in the reference link, but the name of the authors isn't coming to me right now because it's one of about 50 references there. But with that said, I'm also looking into that at the stuff I'm doing at the Botanic Gardens. So I have a measure of connectedness to nature called the Inclusion of Nature in Self scale, the INS scale, and ask the students how they normally felt in relation to nature and how they felt whilst they were at the gardens. So again, a little teaser for some future research that I'll be publishing on that.
So I'm just making sure I've got all the. Kate, I wondered if you wanted to unmute yourself and say a couple of words. Possible?
Hello. So I work at the Gibbegong Environment Centre and also at Field of Mars. And my passion is helping encourage classroom teachers to take the curriculum outside. So that's my mission in life. So I do teacher professional development, and I was just going to say, look, really good news is that at the moment there is so much interest in taking students outside as teachers are returning back to face-to-face teaching. My personal view on it, much like Ryan's, is it's about nature connection. That's where I'm coming from it. I see that curriculum-based outdoor learning is how we can get teachers on board. And then when kids are outside doing their fractions with sticks and, you know, doing adjectives around Banksia cones, that's when they're getting that connection, that hands-on learning. It's multisensory, but it's still curriculum. So, you know, I'm really excited about that. And we've got a couple of webinars coming up for teachers in the Sydney area on that. So, yeah, so great to hear from you guys today. Love your work. Love to see some photos of that learning that you're doing there at PLC, because we could really help encourage other teachers, because I really find that when we can find really great examples of teachers doing this stuff and then we can share it with other teachers, then they go, okay, that's how I can do it, that's how I can get on board. And if other teachers are doing it, then we can kind of all do it. And in my own time, I also do a Facebook group called Outdoor Learning New South Wales. So that's something where anytime I find something that's curriculum-based outdoor learning and it's going to support teachers, I put it up there. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I can find that on Facebook, and I'll get some of the teachers to send me photos without the kids of like the bridges and stuff, and I can pop it on there if you like.
Yeah, look, that would be awesome. And, you know, that's the sort of thing. It doesn't have to be kids. It can be just a little sort of photo of the work sample or anything. And, you know, all that stuff is really great. I mean, it's great publicity for yourself. It's great publicity for your school and what you're doing. But it's also going to support other teachers to say, look, this is what's happening at this school, and we can do that at our school or something similar.
Yeah.
So is there any more questions from any of the other people attending? I got everyone's question. I think so. At the local government end, we're really interested in working with schools and hearing from schools, because we think that this is lifelong learning, and that people like myself are people who are passionate about environment and have ended up in a job where we can do practical, realistic work to protect the environment. Of course, it's always a juggle as places urbanize. One of the wonderful things about the Parramatta River catchment group is really having a stronger approach to creeks and protecting those creeks more. Ideally, you would have 40-meter exclusion zones, and we don't have that, but we're strengthening the creeks and the biodiversity pathways that we do have. So we're working on that. And we're working on having more trees in every LGA for urban cooling, and school kids are really vital in that, because the reason that we don't put more trees in is that we have a number of adults that are anti-tree. So it's just a shift in understanding of the value of nature. And we're really interested in what will happen now that people have been forced to be very local and have had a chance to explore their local areas. And we're just hoping that they'll let us know what they want improved and volunteer to care for things. So anyway, that's where we're up to. So I just like to thank the participants for coming, and to thank Ryan and Laura for their great presentation. I thank you very much.
Wow.
And we'll send out some information to the participants because there was a request for the names of some of those books, Laura.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Jasmine. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.